kind introduction, and I thank the Humanities Center for giving me this opportunity to give this talk. I guess I wanted to begin by, I have a couple handouts here that you see in the list. One is a dedication to, well, I consider a dedication to the members of the Baha'is who were released from prison, from the Iran. They're called the Iran group, and it'll explain it in the handout. The other is a map of Iran and Iraq that'll explain where things are as I go through the talk, so you know where they are. Sometimes we hear these places even in the news today, and we really don't know where they are. And I thought it was rather unfortunate when I thought about that. Is also where the terrible earthquake just happened, and so there's a lot of people are undergoing a lot of hardship there for other reasons too. But maybe I want to dedicate my talk proper to these women. Get this particular thing. It says second member of Iran group released. These women that they're going to talk about, I mean, they have more guts than I could ever imagine. Let me read it and follow with me and you'll understand why. Fariba Kalman-Abadi, a member of the former leadership group of the Baha'is in Iran, recently concluded her unjust 10-year prison sentence. She is the second individual from among the former Iran to be released. Although no longer bound by the confines of the prison, Mrs. Kalabandi, a developmental psychologist, will return to a life in a country that has not changed with respect to its prejudicial and unjust treatment of Baha'is. She will encounter, among many other forms of oppression, a media landscape that is entirely hostile to the Baha'i community. She will also be extremely limited in her access to opportunities in both public and private sector for gainful employment simply because she is a Baha'i, a limitation designed and implemented by the government of Iran after the Islamic Revolution of 1979. Mrs. Kalabandi, 55, was part of the ad hoc group known as Iran, or Friends, which tended to the basic spiritual and material needs of the Iranian Baha'i community, and was born with full knowledge and approval of authorities after the formal Baha'i institutions were declared illegal in Iran in the 1980s. She and other 5 members of the group were arrested in May 2008 after an early morning raid on their homes. After another member, Maravash Sabat, was arrested 2 months earlier, in March 2008, and was released last month, completing her sentence. The 5 remaining members of the Iran are also expected to complete their sentences in the coming months. They are Jamaluddin Kajani, 84, Adnan Amani, 56, Sayed Rezi, 60, Behrouz Tabakuli, 66, and Vahid Tislam, 44. These people are still in prison. Their crime is that simply they were members of the Baha'i community in Iran. And I dedicate my talk to them. Now, let me begin with somewhat an explanation of why these women are in a way part of the history of how the dedication of women in Iran, and it goes back to the story of Tahirih. Now, she was a woman in Iran who helped in the early beginnings of the Baha'i community. There was this beginning between the transition between the Islamic community and the early emergent Baha'i community in Iran. And this was the transition. And she was a critical part of this. So let me start with, I was in the process of reading this, some of the history and doing more research on it. I ran into a quote by the anthropologist Clifford Geertz, who defined religion as a cultural system of symbols in which religious patterns made up of such clusters of symbols, which are frames of perception, symbolic screens through which experience is interpreted while also being guides for action, blueprints for conduct. The importance of religion consists in its capacity to serve for an individual or group as a source in general, yet distinctive conceptions of the world, the self, and relation between them. He says religious concepts spread beyond their metaphysical context to provide a framework of general ideas or paradigms in terms of which a wide range of experience, intellectual, emotional, and moral, can be given a meaningful form. Okay, as I was saying, this transition of history is important to understand, again, why these women are in prison today and why the background, knowing that the early transition between what was the early Islamic community and became the Babi and Baha'i communities in that transition. But as many people know today, there is a division historically within Islam between the Shia and the Sunni. It's two main branches. Now the Sunni, who comprise the vast majority of the world's Muslims, and the Shia, who predominate in Iran and Azerbaijan, and comprise important minorities in a number of other countries. Distinctive features of Shiism include Shias recognize Ali who is the cousin and son-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad, rightful successor in a series of imams or leaders. Different Shia groups recognize a different series of imams. The largest group is that of the Twelvers, or Ithna Ashari, who follow a succession of 12 imams. This is the branch that predominates in Iran, and from which the Babi and Baha'i religions emerged. There are the Ismaili groups, and they have other divisions. Twelvers recognize the teachings of the imams as an important supplement to the authority of the Quran and the traditions of Muhammad. Okay, now, this is important because the Baha'i faith emerged from the Shia a branch of Islam. And the Shias have various kinds of religious practices. Now, what is most important in the Twelver branch is that they have been looking for what was known as characterized that the last imam disappeared underneath the earth, the Shia Islamic Muslims believe, and they're waiting for his occultation or return. And this is known as the Qayyim or the Mahdi. Now, this is important because the man known as the Bab in Iran claimed to be this Qayyim or Mahdi. And so this created a furor in 19th century Iran. It changed the whole system of what was going on in Iran at that time. Many Muslims at this time were expecting this, and there was a group known as the Sheikhis. They were Muslims who believed this to be imminent, and they spread this throughout the country. So, several of these early followers of this Muslim group became Babis, or followers of the Bab. Now, in this transition, the Bab spoke making another man, that there would be another prophet after him. Now, this was crucial in the transition because the 19th century Islam had various cultural practices that came with it. And I'll discuss those a little later. But let me also describe what's happening with the Babis at this time. The Bab had said that there would be known as letters of the living, people who would be looking for him. These individuals scattered throughout the country. And this, again, created a firestorm. But many Muslim clergymen accepted the Bab. And so this, again, changed the social and political atmosphere of Iran. Now, the Bab had claimed that he was one coming in fulfillment of prophecy. So, one of his followers, he had 19 followers, but one was a woman. And let me give you her biography. She was remarkable. And her poetry is what has made her more well known throughout the world. Her poetry is recited all over the Persian, where there's Persian cultural influence. But the fact that she was a follower of the Bab and inadvertently recognized Baha'u'llah, the founder of the Baha'i faith, has been forgotten. Her poetry is recited all over, but people are forgotten. Her original name was Fatima Baragani, but the Bab told her that she gave her the name of Saranjan Taj, or Crown of Gold. She was also known as Qayatul Ain, or Solace of the Eye. She was born into a prominent clerical family in northern Iranian city of Qazvin. Now, if you look at the handout, you'll see where that is. It's in sort of central Iran. Her father, Mullah Muhammad Salah, was a respected, powerful Muhajjid. A Muhajjid is a Muslim cleric, and was born, and was his brother, Muhammad Taqi Baragani. But what was unusual in the 19th century, she was allowed to get higher religious studies in Islam. This was very unusual for a woman of that period. And she eventually gained a great reputation for scholarship. She was regarded as extremely knowledgeable about the traditions and scripture of Islam. When she was 14 years old, she was married to her uncle's son, Muhammad, whom she had 3 sons and 1 daughter. Her husband later became the prayer leader of the Friday prayers, in Qazvin, and was succeeded by her eldest son. When Muhammad Taqi, her uncle, was one of the most vehement opponents of a group of these sheikhs, several of her relatives were known as sheikhs. Now, following suit, she had gone into secret correspondence with a young cleric known as Sayyid Kazan Rashdi. This was a man who had begun the Shaikhi movement. Now, her younger sister married another Muslim cleric, but he later became a Shaikhi. Now, this created these religious differences between what was a very traditional Shia Islam and the Babi movement, created a lot of tension within the family. And later in 1843, she separated from her husband and proceeded with Karbala. Now, if you look on the map, you'll look and find the city of Karbala. This is a famous place where the Muslim imams are buried. And so it's very common still to this day for Shia Muslims to go to these sites and pray at these holy sites. Now, at that point, she had essentially already recognized the Bab, and she was becoming very well known. But this shook up a lot of Iranian Shias, because a woman going around, first of all, speaking broadly to men was very unusual, because in that period, women were supposed to be behind a veil, a large, in the room, the woman would be behind a wall, and the men would be on one part, and the women would be on the other, but when they spoke, they would be speaking behind a large wall or curtain. But she did this, but speaking of the traditions, eventually, as time went on, people were impressed by her knowledge, her great wisdom, and even though she had occasionally taught men, she was known within the prominent elite women of Iran who just adored her. And even in the higher ups among the clerical establishment, Tahirih circled among them. And this upset the Shaikhi establishment and the Shia clerics. Now, but eventually she went to this cleric's home with support of his widow, and where she was promoting the teachings of the Bab. This leadership on the part of a woman, together with her increasing radical understanding of Babiism, reflected in her disregard for Islamic convention, generally opposition from more conservative followers of the Bab, as well as from other Shaykhis. But the Bab himself supported her. But at that time, the clergy were beginning to spread rumors of allegations of misconduct. And I'll explain why later. But the Bab called her pure, the pure Tahirih. Mounting opposition finally caused her to leave Karbala for Baghdad, where she resided for some time in the house of the chief mufti, or that is that was a Sunni cleric, and he let her be in his house. And he was very impressed by both her intellect and her devotion. But then in March 1847, on instruction from the Ottoman government, she was deported. Traveling slowly in western Iran with a large group of supporters, she openly proclaimed Babiism. She returned to Khorasan in July. Now, her and her husband had enormous differences. Her husband was a very traditional Shia Muslim cleric, but she herself, of course, was a follower of the Bab. So her and her husband parted their ways, and she instead of living with her husband, she lived with her brother. Because in Iran at that time, a woman couldn't be by herself. A woman had to be attached in some way to a man, in some fashion. Now, she would play a very crucial role in what would be the earlier part of Babi history. Okay? As this movement spread throughout Iran, both through the women and through the men, through various meetings, the tension within Iran was just enormous. Now, she was one of the principals of the Conference of Badasht, which was, the Bab was imprisoned in, if you look here, up on the map here, northern Iran, eventually the government was very upset about the Bab claiming to be who he was. So they put him in prison in what was far northern Iran, in the prison town of what is known as Maku. Now, it's a range of high, bare mountains. the village of Maku was where the Grand Vizier was born. And so he was sure that the villagers would ignore the Bab, they wouldn't visit him, the public wouldn't see him. One man, his name was Ali Khan, and he was made the Bab's prison warden. But eventually, the gentleness of the Bab and his gentle personality came to be known. And the villagers would stand underneath the castle each morning to see him. So he was becoming much more known. Now, the Grand Vizier was hoping that this would just get rid of the Bab's influence and he would be exiled. So, but what was ironic was the man who was in charge of the Bab in prison himself became a follower of the Bab. And he frequently bought gifts for his prisoner. But when the Grand Vizier heard about this, he got very angry. By sending the Bab away, the Grand Vizier had actually allowed the Bab's teaching to be well known in that part of Iran. So, the Bab had taught something that was different from traditional Islam. He said that he had written a book called the Bayan, which was written down in the Persian language. And he made it clear that some of the Islamic laws regarding prayer, fasting, marriage, and divorce were now being changed. And he spoke about someone coming known as him whom God was made manifest. Now, he told his followers to watch for this. Now, when the Bab was imprisoned in Maku, in this fortified fortress, a conference he had asked was brought together. And they met together in the town of Badasht. I believe it's here. I'm looking for it. It's not on this map. But anyway, they had met together. Now, at this meeting, it was a meeting that racked both the followers of the Bab and the traditional Babis, who at that time were still working within the Shia Islamic context. They were very traditionalist, but they had still believed in the Bab. And being a follower of the Bab was quite a radical thing. You would be put in chains and things like this. And the Bab himself was in prison. So at that time, a conflict had sort of semi-emerged where a man known as Qudus was sort of giving traditional arguments for Islamic convention. But Tahirih stood up and did something radical, something that in Islamic culture to this day is not quite kosher. She had removed her veil, and that itself created a furor. And one of the Babis himself slit his throat. It was too much for him to handle, because Tahirih was seen, even among the Muslims, as someone very holy and very well regarded. And to actually look at her in the presence of an entire assemblage of men was more than he could bear. But the Bab had said that this was a new age. And so that was again a test for these Babis. Now, this radical change within the Babi movement was again discerning for the Babis as well. Because what they understood as being traditional Islam and what the Bab was saying was at length of their understanding. So, but nonetheless, the Babi movement endured and grew. So, why did this occur, and why did this man do this? Let me read what happened. Let me give you what happened. The Bab had told that many of the Babis said, well, who is this Tahirih? The Bab had said that she is among my foremost disciples. And they said, a woman? How dare a woman? This was something very new. But they all respected her, and they couldn't understand why. But when she removed her veil, she said that this was a new age. And she said, I am the word which the Qayyim had willed to utter. So for centuries, the women were unveiled, were put in large veils and separated from the men. And this sudden break with Islamic traditionalism was more than the clergy could bear. And see, let me explain again a little bit about the development of what is known as the Chador. See, one of the things that, if you've seen in the United States, where you may see women with a little slit on their faces, in the United States, it's freely done, but in Iran, it was the law in the 19th century. Women would go to the bathhouse where they could relax, discuss their life, hear news, tell stories, and get groomed. Entrance to the bathhouse was free, so women of various social classes used them, except for the poorest women who could not afford to tip the bathroom attendants. 5 days a week were reserved for men, and 2 days, mornings only, were for women. Men entered the bathhouse by the main street, whereas the entrance for women was at the end of the lane. Women changed from the inside to outside clothes a trip to the bathhouse. A typical inside outfit consisted of wide trousers, a long transport skirt open to the navel with a long sleeved short jacket over it and a bouffant skirt. These were many variations to the basic combination among urban women in the cities. Including among urban women was the use of jewels, the elaborateness of floral patterns and materials, and the quality of fabrics. All women wore some sort of basic headscarf out of modesty in rural areas. Also, this kept their hair clean. Rural women did not wear the face veil much for practical reasons. They did most of the constant physical work, and the face veil was a real impediment. Over the course of the 19th century, the black body covering known as the Chador became more common. The wearing of veils was an ancient practice throughout the Middle East, possibly originating in ancient Mesopotamia or with the ancient Assyrians, and then picked up by the Persians as their empire over regions where women were veiled. When the Arabs made their conquest of their Byzantine territories in the Middle East, they came into contact with the face veil and incorporated it into their own way of life. The veil did not originate with Persia or Islam, but rather local tribal customs. So theirs was a great deal of variation in these outfits. Though it became a sign of religious purity, it also served a means of secluding and owning women. Shia law and Qajar practice, that was the reign of the king, did not allow women to initiate divorce, something which was not universally the case in the rest of the Muslim world, and for which there was little Quranic basis. While women did leave their husbands during this period, there were considerable obstacles. Women, for the most part, did not have an independent source of income and could not live simply on their own. They had to be part of a household headed by a man whom they were related. While women could get trapped in an unhappy marriage, a man had a religiously sanctioned way of having relations with someone other than his wife. He could pay a cleric to get permission for a temporary marriage. This practice was thinly justified by a particular Quranic chapter, but actually predated Islam. Temporary marriages were a reflection of a woman's inferior position in Qajar Persia, and Shia law, rather than the true expression of the Quranic teaching on the correct moral behavior of women and men. So women were put behind these little constrictors. They had to be behind a veil when they talked, unless they were among their relatives. So, again, at the conference of Badash, a woman removing her veil in public among men that were not her relations was seen as scandalous. But Tahirih asserted that this was a new day, that this was a day that women could no longer have to do this, that this was a new day and a new time. But this enraged the establishment, both the male clerical hierarchy and the political establishment. For women to go around in public, as she did, was just too much. And eventually, her death was imminent. Let me quote the story of how she was put to death. Before I do that, let me assert one of the things that she did, again, at this conference that made it. She said, she said that this was the time that the old ways would be abandoned and a new day would come. But again, as I said, the Shia clerical establishment and the political establishment didn't like it. But eventually, her death was called for, and she was put in a home, and she was aware that her death was imminent. One night, aware at the hour of her death was at hand, she was on the attire of a bride. She took on the attire of a bride. She took on a bridal gown and anointed herself with perfume, and setting off for the wife of this man who was her protector. She communicated to him the secret of her impending martyrdom and confided her last wishes. Then, closeting herself in her chambers, she waited in prayer and meditation, the hour of which was to witness her union with her beloved. She was pacing the room, chanting a litany of expressive poems, both in grief and triumph, when suddenly the fire ushers came, these were the police officers, arrived in the dead of night to conduct the sight of her death, of her martyrdom. When he arrived in the midst of a drunken debauch with his lieutenants, and was roaring with laughter, he was ordered offhand that she be strangled at once and thrown into the pit. With the same silken kerchief which she reserved for that purpose, she delivered her last moments to the son of this police officer, to this gentleman who accompanied her. The death of this immortal heroine was accomplished. Her body was lowered into a well, which was then filled with earth and stones in the manner which she herself declared. Thus ended the life of this great body heroine, a woman suffrage martyr, who at the hour of her death turned to the one who was entrusted her custody was placed, and she boldly declared, "You can kill me as soon as you like, but you cannot stop the emancipation of women." So they took her body and dumped it into a well. Thus ended her life, but not her reputation. But again, she had gone throughout the kingdom proclaiming women's rights. And again, this is how her death was occurred. What made her famous, well, again, was her poetry. And I have one of her poems. Her poems are, as I said, are often used throughout the Persian cultural world. But again, their link to the Babi and Baha'i faith are completely forgotten. I'll read briefly one of her, a part of one of her poems, and then we can ask for questions. One of them is, one of her, this is a poem, by the way. The Shah, Nasruddin Shah, the Shah of Iran, the king of Iran, promised, in some historical accounts, actually promised to marry her if she would renounce her beliefs. Instead, she wrote a poem to it. And in this poem, on one hand, she shuns off she says how wonderful it is to die for her beloved. On the other hand, she makes disgrace of this so-called offer of marriage to the king. She says in this translated poem, oh, by the way, the poems, many of her poems were published in English for the first time by who was notable at the time, was a British historian known as Edward Granville Browne. And he had published in English many of her poems, and they went throughout the world in English, even just after her death. The raptures of yearning for you have constrained with the chains of sorrow and calamity all the broken-hearted lovers who gladly give up their lives in the path of your love. And if out of caprice or cruelty my beloved be intent on slaying me, stainless though I be, I will be patient under his sword, and I will content myself with whatsoever contents him. At dawn, that cruel charmer of mine designed to approach my bed, and when I saw his face, it was as if the morning itself had dawned. No musky scent in Khotan can match the fragrance of his tresses. No infidel in all possesses the seditious eyes as those of my beloved. But you, O king, ignorant of wine's ecstasy and love's longing, can but pace behind the pious ones, the ascetics. And what can I do with you to doubt or disdain the holy motives of the sanctified ones? You desire only a woman's dangling ringlets, the well-bred steed, the silver-studded jewel, saddle. Your entire life you have been ungrateful to the poor. You have abhorred the destitute in your midst. For you there exist empires only, Alexander's pomp and glory. For me, the ways and habit of the dervish suffice. You adore your kingdoms, you take them. As for me, my chastisement is bounty enough. So, I guess there's a lot of things left unsaid. There's a lot more to her life, but her poetry is what has made her more famous in the Western world and in English. There are more up-to-date translations of her poetry. I have one, but Persian's edition exists all over the place. I hope I've connected the things, but any questions, free to ask. Yeah.
So, when she was put to death, like what even happened? They threw her in a well?
I'm sorry, what happened to her in the well?
How did she die? Like she was thrown in a well?
Yeah, she was thrown out after they strangled her. After they strangled her, they threw her body in the well, and then it was put on stones and other things like this, and then they just left it there.
Wow.
Yeah. But that's basically what happened to her. But again, going throughout the length of Breath of Persia, she had been among many of the prominent elite women in Iran at that time. Were mourning her death, but again, she died in that manner, as she herself was anticipating.
Is the site marked, or do people go?
Yeah.
There?
No. In Iran, most of the Baha'i holy places are destroyed. We don't know the exact spot where she was buried, largely because the government has covered it up, and so we don't know the exact spot. Historians are currently looking for that spot. There is some historical research being done on that. But we don't know the exact spot. The well, a lot of things have changed. A lot of things were moved around. A lot of the places were demolished. Anything that had to do with Babi or Baha'i history was bulldozed or whatever. So we don't know the exact spot. Yeah.
Have you ever thought about comparing her to Walada?
To who?
To Walada.
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 She was a poet in Andalus before the Spaniards forced the Muslims out of southern Spain. And she had a similar kind of story. She was marginalized. She was elite. She was a poet. And she was marginalized. She's still marginalized. So I was just wondering if you've done much research.
I never thought of that. That's rather fascinating. I'd like to find out more about her.
Yeah, I've got an article about her. She was in History Today about a year or so ago. I can email it to you if you like.
Great. I'd like to see that.
I'll talk to you after the talk.
Thanks.
Sure.
Yeah. Yes.
So if I understood you right, the Baha'i faith was founded or grew in Iran originally?
Yes.
And from your article about people being in prison, it sounds like they were being discriminated against.
Oh yes, very much so.
The question I'm eventually getting to is, sometimes when a group is discriminated against, they don't see themselves as part of that culture. So I'm wondering if people of the Baha'i faith identify with Iran.
Okay. Well. Okay. Well. Many, as there are Baha'is in many different countries, they identify with the historical things going on in Iran. The Iranian Baha'is are strongly regard themselves as Persians and Iranians, although there are many different groups within it, Kurds, Baluchis, all these other groups that are Baha'is, but they see themselves as part of the Persian nation and are proud of it. But individual Baha'is from different countries identify with historical events, of course, but don't view themselves as part of Persian culture. They're, part of their own culture too. But that's part of the diversity.
Okay. So if you ran into somebody, a Baha'i around here, you wouldn't necessarily assume any connection other than historical back to Iran.
Right. Although there are certainly immigrants from Iran, here there are Baha'is. Many Baha'is here are American, of various ethnicities, but they're not necessarily Iranian. Yeah.
Did you get into how you became a Baha'i?
Well, that's many years ago, about 20 years ago. Okay. So, all these different events that bring people into the faith or whatever are products of a long series of things that people do, But in Iran, just admitting that you're a Baha'i can get you into prison. You can't go to the police and say, somebody loaned me some money, and you can't go there. You can't do that. So here, we have the freedom to be who we are, but in Iran, no, not the case. So I thank you very much. Yes.
Why is that? Why is the feeling so strong that it would get a person in prison?
Well, in Iran, the Baha'i faith is regarded as a heresy of Shia Islam. And throughout the Middle East, the Baha'i faith is under severe restrictions, if it is even allowed to permit. In Yemen and in Iran, the Baha'is, again, are still, like you saw here, put in prison, or their businesses are taken, or their property is confiscated. Baha'i children are not allowed they're told, if your parents don't do what they do, don't convert to true Islam, they're told that they will. And so, you're just a minority, and you're reminded that you're a minority. Throughout the Middle East, there are rare exceptions to this, where perhaps in Turkey, but even there, it's kind of quiet if you're a Baha'i. You're not allowed.
Is the faith growing? Is it atrophying? Is the group getting smaller, larger?
No, the Baha'i faith is growing throughout the world. It is growing quite fast. Statistically, there are approximately 5 million Baha'is in the world, but its expansion is quite big. But in terms of in Iran, the Baha'is are just happy they're alive. And I'm amazed at these women. When I look at these women right now, to be in prison for 10 years for something you committed no crime, you did nothing wrong. It's just more than I can imagine. So I thank you.
Thank you.